Today, a quarter of the world's population lives in areas threatened by fragility, conflict, or large-scale criminal violence. This is a major threat to people's lives, livelihoods, and development. If states want to escape the downward spiral of insecurity, criminalisation, and underdevelopment, then socio-economic and security challenges need to be tackled together. There is no development without security, and there will be no security without development. Security is a basic human need. People want to feel safe and secure just as much as they need food to eat, water to drink, and a job to give them an income. An effective and accountable system of security and justice can be a force for peace, creating a conducive environment where political, social, and economic development can take shape. Security forces that are poorly trained, badly equipped, and badly managed can be a cause of insecurity. Building the effectiveness of security actors without adequate governance, accountability, and oversight can lead to abuses, undermining human rights and the rule of law. Reform of the security and justice sector, however, is a complex and dynamic process. It requires a multidisciplinary approach, long-term engagement, clarity in its implementation, and political will. Security sector reform, governance and development have become a major framework of UN peacekeeping operations. Almost all UN peacekeeping operations now have a security sector reform element to them. UN Security Council Resolution 2151 from 2014 was the first major UN Security Council resolution which looked at security sector reform. Titled The Maintenance of International Peace and Security, it looked at challenges and opportunities for security sector reform. It established also a fundamental approach of national ownership for security sector reform processes. What it had helped to do in that case was to look at the role of security sector reform and its role, particularly the prevention of violent extremism, and particularly therefore how it relates with peace building. In a traditional concept, security sector reform is something that starts after the conflict is over. There's very little time or opportunity for security sector reform as conflict starts on a more vigorous process, and it eventually gets to a point where there is no room for security sector reform. But after that point, after the peace building accord is in place, then there is much more room then for security sector reform. However, if you look at security sector reform with regards to the role that it can play in a preventative role, then the idea is that the more security sector reform you can do before conflict kicks off or reignites, then essentially the more you can build on later and the more it's able to establish itself as a means of sustainable peace. It's as a result of this kind of thinking that the need for security sector reform training and security capacity building training as a part of security sector reform is really crucial. If we look in particular at UN Security Council Resolution 2086 from 2014, which was on United Nations peacekeeping operations, you'll see that paragraph 11 in fact underlines the importance of deploying peacekeepers with professional skills, training, experience, excellence, and in adherence to the United Nations Zero Tolerance policy for misconduct, and in this regard encourages troop and police contributing countries in the spirit of partnership to continue to contribute professional military and police personnel with the necessary skills and experience to implement multidimensional peacekeeping mandates. So UN Security Council Resolution 2086 puts the onus on troop contributing countries to ensure that they're deploying troops and police and civilian staff are well trained prior to going into any peacekeeping operation. This, therefore, obviously has a big role made available for peacekeeping training centres. If we look at Africans' contribution to peacekeeping, we see that 50% of troop contributing countries are in fact from the Africa region. This puts a big emphasis on police and peacekeeping operations training centres to make sure that they get their training as suitable as they possibly can. If we look at the role of peacekeeping training centres and what they need to try to cover now for those that are deploying out to peacekeeping operations, we can see that over the years there's become a growing complexity of the types of tasks that peacekeepers have to conduct when they are on a peacekeeping mission. Back in the kind of 60s, or all the way through up even to the 90s, the kind of roles that peacekeeping trainers or peacekeepers undertook was monitoring and protection, keeping warring factions apart. Over time, though, throughout the 90s, and particularly as we start to get into the 21st century, we're looking more at interim law enforcement, training and mentoring, advisory support, and actual operational support on the ground. More recently, we've looked at law enforcement capacity building, and now security sector reform and security capacity building. Training for peace support operations tends to fall into one of two categories. There's pre-deployment training, and then additionally there is pre-employment selection and preparation. Pre-deployment training looks at cultural and language training, it looks at operating perhaps in a semi-permissive environment, and it tends to concentrate also on producing a militarily safe and secure environment in which troops can operate. This is a very theatre-specific type of training. Pre-employment training, on the other hand, looks at selection and preparation for people into a post. It is therefore posting specific. It might look in more multi-dimensional peace support operations at aspects of security sector reform, governance and development, as well as security capacity building of host nation forces to be able to take over from peace support operations in due course. Part of the skills needed for this area are conflict and needs analysis, advising and mentoring skills, and monitoring and evaluation in order to make sure that what is being done, what is being trained, actually has an effect and isn't just simply about activity. As a result, peace support operations training and preparation needs to make sure that it is appropriate pre-employment and in-mission education in order that that can in turn deliver effective in-mission implementation of multi-dimensional peace support operations. Traditionally, train and equip has been used both to provide peacekeepers and to train up those peacekeepers perhaps at peacekeeping training centres, and in turn peacekeepers have reverted to a train and equip approach in order to build up security capacity for host nation security forces once in country. This traditional approach, however, to capacity building tends to build up combat effectiveness at the expense of accountability. This tends to favour training for tactical combat effectiveness at the expense of establishing accountability mechanisms, including proper organisational and unit-level command and control. This can work where governance, accountability and internal control safeguards are already strong for security exporters. However, to build the capacity of security importers who are faced with significant challenges in delivering a service of security to citizens, a one-dimensional train and equip approach is insufficient. Lieutenant General Mark Caron, former Chief of Army in Canada, explains.
Coordinated action, for example, in another country that I served with, there were many nations providing military assistance, and all of those countries were all providing the same thing: training, battalion training, a tactical unit in tactical operation. All of them were doing the same thing. Nobody was looking after human resources management or equipment management, or even recruiting system, or even basic training system.
Once trained, peacekeepers need to make sure as well that there are sustainability aspects to the training that they have delivered. This can take the form of support for more institutionalised selection and preparation of candidates for training, making sure we also take into account elements of gender and ethnic representation. It involves also establishing or linking training to recognised standards, ensuring subsequent monitoring and oversight of those trained to ensure that they are actually using the skills that they have been given in an appropriate manner. This can therefore require advice on institutional human resource and career development policies in order to retain trained staff and allow them to use those skills. Finally, it's absolutely crucial that trained staff contribute to improving the learning and training materials once they have returned from mission deployment. So there's a need overall to bridge the capacity gap that exists in a post-conflict situation. Looking here at this slide, we can see that after a conflict, there's an awful lot of assistance that comes into a country. You look at Mali now, for instance, there's more assistance and aid coming into Mali than there probably has been to many, many countries after conflict. But the capacity to be able to actually cope with all that aid coming in is not yet at a stage that it can cope with that assistance coming in. This therefore brings in what we call a capacity accountability gap. But it's not just a capacity accountability gap with regards to the ability of a country to absorb that assistance that is coming in. There is also a gap in how peacekeeping personnel are able to provide the right kind of assistance to build up the capacity of a nation state. The traditional approach to capacity building has essentially been train and equip, but this is very much a one-dimensional approach. It tends to favour effectiveness over accountability, when in fact what we really need to do is marry up and balance out those two elements of accountability and effectiveness. The kind of reports and research that is going on to date with regards to how train and equip programmes in particular have been going show that concentrating on effectiveness often comes at the expense of accountability. So what can be done to look at making sure that security capacity building goes beyond a single one-dimensional approach? There have been a number of organisations that are starting to look at the nuances of capacity building, looking at the conditions for capacity building, the substance of capacity building, and particularly looking at second and third order or unintended consequences of what is the relationship of capacity building supply as it is today with regards to the relationship to the opportunities for developing leadership in those countries where we are trying to build security capacity. Some of the measures that have come out of lessons that have been identified in the programmes of Train and Equip are actually taking shape now in policy. And we have seen that most recently in the National Defence Authorisation Act of the USA of 2017. In that act, US authority to build capacity must include respect for law of armed conflict, in other words, LOAC, respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, and the respect for rule of law. It must also include respect for civilian control of the military, a comprehensive curriculum of human rights training, and institutional capacity building to enhance the capacity of such foreign country to exercise responsible civilian control of the national security forces of that foreign country. What does that mean? What that means is that there's starting to be a recognition that train and equip in and of itself is actually only one small aspect of what needs to be done. If it's not embedded in a larger institution building process, then in fact you can train and equip all year long, but it doesn't actually bed in. There are plenty of models out there that start to look at organisational change, which look at, for instance, a 5-level model whereby there's a need to make sure there is the political will in place for such training to stay in place. There's a regulatory framework to ensure that accountability and checks and balances are also there, that there is support from an inter-organisational perspective, so the checks and balances of Parliament over what is being done, for instance, and then intra-organisational development as well, those internal governance aspects and internal control aspects. Finally, and only then, will training really have any chance of sticking. That's policy on the one side. Practice on the other side, we are seeing that some organisations, some countries are starting to develop a capability that is looking at security capacity building in a much greater detail. NATO has been doing this, in fact, for some time, but only recently has brought together its Defence Capacity Building Initiative, or DCBI, to bring together all of the many aspects across international staff and international military staff who can look at what they have available to help a country to build its own capacity, whether that's part of joining NATO or purely because it's looking at interoperational aspects of capacity building and building up its enhancement of capacity. Germany has also started its Enable and Enhance initiative now for about 2 years. And this is a major piece whereby they are looking at how they can assist security capacity building in foreign countries and look more closely at what does that involve. UK 77th Brigade, their outreach group for security capacity building, is also looking at the military aspects in particular of security capacity building. But whilst that policy is starting to be in place and that practice is starting to show some units that are concentrating on this, practitioners and peacekeepers struggle to articulate the methodology for security capacity building and professional military development that enables, at the end of the day, a self-sufficient capacity for security. So what is it that needs to be built? What is it that needs to be measured? Yesterday, you will have had 2 sessions that looked at both of these areas, both measuring peacekeeping capabilities and evaluating peacekeeping missions. What are some of the things that we see that are going on elsewhere to look at these areas? The United States Institute for Peace, in particular, has been working with the National Defense University in the USA to look at the conditions that are needed for building sustainable capacity. They have identified 6 areas, or 6 conditions, for building such capacity. One of those areas is to look at understanding the systemic context of what is going on. Secondly, to leverage partner country capabilities themselves. These are the ones, of course, that need to be built up. Thirdly, addressing human and institutional gaps. Because if these are not addressed, then one can do training in one area, but in fact there are other areas that are bringing that down. Fourthly, developing partnership with recipient stakeholders, again, so that there is that intra and inter-organisational support that's needed. And then fifthly, embedding knowledge in institutions and processes that essentially have a life of their own that can help to shore up the training that's put in place. And then finally, melding local knowledge with external expertise. And that is the point at which external assistance can come in and give that bit of a boost to help security capacity building. Another dimension of security capacity building is to look at the substance. What is it exactly that we are trying to get across? What are the components, for instance, of institutional strength? British defence doctrine, for some time now, has looked at 3 aspects of institutional strength, or what they would call fighting power. There's the physical component, which is traditionally what Train and Equip will concentrate on. There's also the intellectual or the conceptual component, such as operational planning. But there's also, and most crucially, the moral component, looking at integrity, accountability, governance, the morale of troops, the reason why we fight, and the motivation for it. This is that part that looks at leadership, something absolutely crucial if security capacity building is to take hold and keep going long after we have gone. But security capacity building and training on security capacity building comes with potential risks, particularly if it's delivered by a donor nation, by an outside expert. If we deliver that training, what are we doing then with regards to actually allowing opportunities for leadership to develop in those countries and in those nations' militaries? This is an aspect of security capacity building that we need to get right, and it's something that is not yet been fully explored as to how we can do this so that it doesn't rob countries of the opportunity to develop that leadership, to lead their own capacity in a self-sufficient manner. So going back to what it is that we need to look at in order to, what it is we need to build and what it is we need to measure, we can see that there needs to be much more than just looking at the train and equip of traditional fighting forces. In order to sustain that fighting force, we also need to look at command and control links to accountability. We need to look at inclusiveness, efficiency, oversight, management, leadership, legitimacy, and integrity. These are only some of the aspects that enable a military to keep going, along with resource oversight and fighting that actual fighting force itself. So for peacekeeping training centres, what do they have available in order to make sure that they can start to respond to the needs for security capacity building and wider aspects of security sector reform? There is some material available already, especially on security sector reform. There are face-to-face trainings available, introductions to security and justice, or advanced courses. There are also the opportunity to make the most of specialised sensitisations and in-mission workshops. Pre-deployment training is one aspect, but in-mission training is also something that can actually concentrate on what is needed for a specific area at a specific time. And of course there are e-learnings. Some of these are available in fact for free and on a variety of topics, including SSR as an introduction, also looking at strategic advising in reform environments, policing and police reform, and police integrity. More of these kinds of e-learnings are coming online, and these are available, if we're lucky, for free. There are also resources available, not just in the form of e-learnings and trainings, but also with regards to material on resource libraries, research products and publications, and communities of practice, which are growing in security sector reform. There's the community of practice from the DCAF ISAT website, but also the IMPROL community of practice, which is the international network on promoting rule of law. However, at the end of the day, more tailored modules are really needed. Modules that start to look at organisational change in security institutions, risk mitigation for second and third order effects, identifying centres of gravity for multiplying that capacity, looking at counter-corruption measures in resource management and combat service support. A lot of work is being done here already with Transparency International. We look forward to the day when maybe something like that will be available for peacekeeping training centres to use in their pre-deployment and in-mission training. Finally, leadership. There's a lot of work to be done on leadership and how we can develop leadership, professional development and codes of conduct.